Tvbs 的观众朋友，大家好，我是刘婷婷。我们今天非常荣幸能够邀请到美国前白宫副国安顾问博明来到我们的新闻现场，他在台湾接受我们的独家专访。Welcome to Taiwan.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's good to see you.
Yeah, really very happy and honored to have you in Taiwan. We know that you served as Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021, but you left office on January the 6th following the U.S. Capitol attacks.
Yes.
And now you actually serve as the chairman of the China program for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Yes.
And you edited and also co-authored a book called The Boiling Mode: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan, or in Mandarin, 沸腾的护城河保卫台湾的紧迫行动 where you extensively actually talk about the recommendations you have for Taiwan and the challenges that democracies actually now face. So I'm very interested and welcome back to Taiwan. First question first, how is your trip this time and how is your meeting with President Lai like?
Oh, it's great. So I'm very glad to be back. It's the Chinese edition of the book is coming out this week. I had the honor of meeting with President Lai to discuss the book, to talk about current situation in the world. He gave me a bit of an update on some of his priorities with respect to a whole of society resilience initiative, which I think is important. And we also talked about Taiwan's defense budget. And this is a really important issue for President Trump. When I would brief President Trump, when I worked for him, he always wanted to know what is the trade deficit with a country. And he also wanted to know for friendly countries, allies and partners of the United States, how much are they spending on their defense as a percentage of GDP? So President Trump expects to see all of America's allies increasing their defense spending as a percentage of GDP. And so I was very heartened that President Lai has announced a special budget to raise Taiwan defense spending to at least 3% of GDP. And that's equal to where the United States is right now. President Trump has said he's going to increase U.S. defense spending. It makes sense for Taiwan to also be increasing defense spending, particularly because it's a signal to the United States. It's a signal to President Trump personally that Taiwan is committed to its own defense in order to deter a conflict.
Okay, but in your book, you actually made a lot of recommendations and positive examples from the Tsai administration. Do you think the Lai administration has been responsive enough?
Look, I think he's been in office now for under a year, half a year, right? But he was elected a little over a year ago and then inaugurated in May. I have a sense that there's a sense of urgency, which I think is a good sign. I think the United States and Taiwan and Japan, I was in Japan last week, Australia, the Philippines, friends and allies of the United States all need to have a sense of urgency in order to deter. The goal is to avoid or prevent a conflict. So that's really the key lesson from Ukraine. It's better to deter. It's cheaper to deter than to suffer a conflict because we weren't strong enough and ended up inviting aggression.
This is exactly a quote from your book. And I'm just curious, how much time do we have left?
Taiwan can decide, has a vote in how much time it has left. The more effective it is at building up its capabilities, the more effective it is in projecting confidence that Taiwan is able to defend itself. The United States gets a vote. You know, the more support the United States shows for Taiwan. And then, of course, the adversary in Beijing gets a vote. Xi Jinping has not said exactly what timeline he's thinking of, but he's been very clear that he is impatient. He has said things like, I will not pass along this Taiwan question to another generation. That's a very significant statement. He has said that the essence of his overall policy of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is to unify all of the parts of China that he claims. So I think that's a sign of urgency. He is probably going to be in power for the rest of his life. He's in his early 70s. So I think that's how much time Taiwan has left. Somewhere between the end of Xi Jinping's life and right now.
One striking recommendation you made in your book is how Taiwan should actually divest her submarine programs. So I quote, "Cancel all new submarine procurement, keeping only a single new Nowar-class indigenous submarine, and should instead invest in uncrewed undersea vehicles and expendable sea drones, drawing lessons from Ukraine." However, we continue to observe that the Lai administration is really quite determined to push for the submarine program, building 7 in 14 years actually.
Right.
Do you continue to believe that money should be better utilized?
So that chapter was written by one of my co-authors. That is his personal advice, was to spend money on programs that would be delivered faster and would be more dangerous sooner to the Chinese Navy. Ultimately, it's up to Taiwan to decide. That money was budgeted in previous parliaments, earlier sessions of the Li Fa Yuan. And ultimately, it's going to be up to President Lai and the Congress here to decide whether they want to proceed with more of these submarines. I think it's okay to shift some money as new information comes available. And we're seeing the nature of warfare changing on the Ukraine front. Drones are more important than ever, both in the skies and also on the seas, and even underwater drones, sea mines, anti-ship missiles, things of this nature that Taiwan needs to be making and procuring and stockpiling so that it can fight and demonstrate to Beijing that it's capable of fighting a longer conflict. What I don't think makes sense is to trim budgets or freeze budgets with no plan for repurposing that money for urgently needed defense systems.
In your trip to the parliament, you actually met with various legislators this time, and that includes the DPP legislators Wang Jingyu. And he actually revealed in a Facebook post that your delegation actually expressed deep concerns how the issue of Taiwan's ongoing budget feud is giving the new Trump administration an increasingly negative impression. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I was very lucky to meet with a few legislators, including Wang Jingyu. I met with Xu Qiaoxin of the KMT. I met with President Han Kuo-yu, and we had a very good and frank exchange of ideas. I'm not here to represent the Trump administration, but I did give very frank advice about how I believe President Trump would interpret budget signals from Taiwan, which is why it's so important for Taiwan to move forward with a special budget to show that it's increasing defense spending. 3% of GDP may sound like a lot, but in historical terms, it's not a lot. The United States during the Cold War, when President Reagan was in office for the final decade of the Cold War, he spent 6.8% of American GDP on defense and was able to bring the Cold War to a safe, peaceful conclusion. So if you really want to see something expensive, fight a war. War is the most expensive human endeavor. People lose their lives, they lose their limbs. From a budgetary standpoint, right now, from what I heard recently, Ukraine is spending about 37% of its GDP on defense. So in light of that context, for Taiwan to spend 3% or higher of its GDP on defense is a really cheap investment in Taiwan's security.
So deterrence is always more important in that
Definitely,
sense.
yeah.
Okay.
We want to deter rather than fight. But the paradox is you have to show that you're willing and able to fight in order to deter. That's the nature of what President Trump calls peace through strength.
Today is the 20th of February, and US President Trump actually called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator and declared that Zelensky better move faster. He's not going to have a country left. So people in Taiwan are watching this very, very closely
Sure.
and very nervously, actually. So given that Taiwan's defense strategy actually heavily depended on U.S. support, how should Taiwan interpret these signals, and what steps should Taiwan take to ensure that this continued bipartisan U.S. support, regardless of election results?
Absolutely. Well, look, the first step for Taiwan is always take matters into your own hands. As a famous admiral in Taiwan once said, "Heaven helps those who help themselves." And have a similar mindset to Israel or to Estonia or other small countries that face formidable big adversaries, and show that you're capable and willing to fight, and then others will come to Taiwan's support. President Trump's approach, he uses all kinds of rhetoric when he's negotiating, and I would wait to see what the actual result of his negotiation is with Ukraine. If he does a deal to stop the war with Russia, and that deal protects Ukraine's sovereignty, wherever that demarcation line is, as long as Ukraine has a very significant security guarantee with obvious military support from Western countries to ensure that Russia is not tempted to resume the war, that's a very good outcome if that's where we end up. That's actually good for Taiwan because it means that the Ukrainians will have in effect halted aggression, aggression that was very costly to both sides, aggression that so far has taken about 20% of Ukraine's territory, and that territory is going to be up for negotiation. How much land will Ukraine be willing to cede? But let's say we end up with a deal where the war stops and Ukraine is secure. That's a very good outcome. That should send a positive signal to Taiwan. It should send a negative signal to Beijing. If, on the other hand, the deal surrenders sovereignty of Ukraine and there's no guarantee for security, that's a very negative outcome. And I'm hopeful that that's not the kind of deal that I don't think President Trump wants to be saddled with the legacy of a failed deal. I think he wants a successful deal that ends the fighting, but also ensures that the fighting doesn't restart because of an insufficient security guarantee for Ukraine.
Given that you have worked closely with President Trump during his first administration, he's rather known to be transactional, like economic policy, foreign policy, wanting people to spend more, while at the same time to show more commitment. But what hard guarantees can Taiwan actually secure to be treated just as a bargaining chip?
It's funny, the thing about President Trump is he's actually fairly consistent on some of these key principles that are part of his worldview. One of them is reciprocity. It's this idea that if the United States is going to provide for the security of a friend, he expects that country to shoulder a significant part of that burden for their own defense. He has the same idea when it comes to trade. He hates trade deficits. So he tries to negotiate in ways that balance trade or that find ways of compensating for a trade deficit. So he's been very consistent about that. If you read what he was saying in the 1980s, it was actually very consistent with this idea of reciprocity. The other thing that he's looking at, of course, is reindustrialization. Reindustrialization, the idea that more investment should come into the United States to rebuild manufacturing capacity. That's a reasonable thing for a great power to want to achieve. We never should have allowed so much of our industrial capacity to hollow out. And it's one thing when industrial capacity migrates to friendly countries. It's an entirely different thing when the United States put itself in a position where it has to be dependent on the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, for critical inputs into our economy. So President Trump has been pretty consistent in trying to steer to incentivize foreign direct investment to come into the United States.
Taiwan being a global semiconductor powerhouse,
yes.
How do you think that Taiwan can leverage on its economic strengths in this?
Well, look, Taiwan built the greatest semiconductor manufacturing company in the world, Morris Chang's vision that was realized to build TSMC. It's the envy of the world. I think it makes sense for TSMC to continue its investment into the United States, to expand that investment. TSMC is actually expanding its investment in Taiwan, right? I mean, if you drive Highway number 3, to Hsinchu, it's fab after fab after fab. It's all TSMC. Ultimately, TSMC is going to need to expand to where its market is. Who are the biggest customers of TSMC? It's NVIDIA, it's an American company. It's Apple, another American company, and other companies in third and fourth place. So for TSMC to have more investment in the US, it actually binds Taiwan and the US even more closely. Their fates are more tightly bound. And TSMC ultimately has to grow someplace because it's running out of room in Taiwan.
So this actually runs on a previous idea where you talk about reciprocity. But I want to bring up the idea how Taiwan, in the past when we talk about freedom, democracy, we have this idea that we need to protect this part of Taiwan. It is very important. Do you think that this kind of freedom and democracy will continue to resonate with the new Trump administration, with the current White House, or does Taiwan need to seek new methods to promote itself? Well,
look, I think if you look at President Trump's comments about the Western Hemisphere, close to home, which he talked about a lot in his inaugural address. Yeah. If you go back to some of the speeches he gave in his first administration, they were strongly anti-communist, anti-authoritarian. He talked about wanting to create a Western Hemisphere that is fully free, okay? So it's clear from his speeches that he thinks that free enterprise, free people really resonates with him, particularly in America's neighborhood. It stands to reason that when you have one of the world's freest countries of all, that's Taiwan, he wants to see Taiwan continue to prosper. He knows that one of the reasons Taiwan prospers so much is because it is a free market society that enjoys the rule of law. It's democratic. But the way to his heart is to focus on those concepts of reciprocity and the concept of reindustrialization. Those are the things that he wants in return, in essence, for helping to protect Taiwan.
Reuters filed a recent story about the $10 billion of how Taiwan is willing to invest in military article procurement. Do you think they will actually sell well in the States?
Certainly, I think Taiwan needs to be investing in its own industrial base, right? Taiwan needs to be able to make many of the munitions that it needs to fight here in Taiwan. There are things that the US would benefit from purchasing from Taiwan for our own defense purposes. For example, right now we depend on China for the inputs for making drones. That should obviously migrate away from China. And one of the obvious places that that supply chain would be very effective and technologically advanced, but also more secure, would be in Taiwan. At the same time, the United States makes weapon systems that Taiwan isn't able to make here. Taiwan should be purchasing there. Taiwan doesn't have a lot of options for where to buy its weapon systems. So the United States ends up being a very key partner in that respect. But that makes sense. That's one of the articles that Taiwan needs to buy, just like the United States buys massive amounts of semiconductors from Taiwan right now.
On February 7th, President Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba actually issued a joint statement on the Taiwan Strait to talk about opposing any attempt to change the status quo through force or coercion. And after that, the State Department actually removed language stating that it does not support Taiwan independence, but they also clarified that there's no change in policy. So do you think that this shows a meaningful policy shift, or is it just posturing?
Well, in terms of the statement that President Trump issued with Prime Minister Ishiba, I think that is meaningful. That was a very good statement. Even the first sentence of that statement was very strong, but it goes on to talk about Taiwan and how important it is to prevent, unilateral coercion of Taiwan. That's a very good statement. I think that is reflective of where the new Trump administration is. On the second point, those statements on the website of the State Department, I honestly don't know. I don't know what how those decisions were made, but I wouldn't read too much into those moves. That would be my first instinct.
Okay, you actually developed Trump's first administration's policies on China. Do you see many of this continuing until right now? Let's say like 4 or 5 years on.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the first Trump administration, President Trump was the first president to really pivot away from what had proven to be a threadbare, failing policy of prioritizing engagement with China at the expense of U.S. economic and national security. President Trump pivoted. He imposed tariffs to punish China's theft of American intellectual property. He created new tools like export controls to prevent the People's Republic of China from acquiring really cutting-edge technologies that could be used to advance its military capabilities, which threaten American troops. He fashioned the first capital controls, and so those kinds of things continued on even in the Biden administration. President Biden had run on this idea that he would reverse Trump's China policies. Actually, he didn't reverse them. President Trump picks up kind of where he left off with his first administration, and one of his first steps was to impose a 10% tariff on China for its role in subsidizing the fentanyl trade, which kills about 70,000 or more Americans each year and ruins households and communities.
So former President Biden actually used the PDA and the FMF as tools,
Yes.
To expedite U.S. military aid to Taiwan. How confident are you that President Trump will continue to leverage on these tools?
I assume that he'll continue with that, but I don't know for sure. That's one that you should ask the new Secretary of Defense. But those were very useful tools in the first administration, and to me it makes sense to continue.
Your book actually argues that Beijing leadership must fear the consequences of attacking Taiwan. What do you think that Xi Jinping is biggest vulnerabilities are, and how can Taiwan and her allies exploit them?
Yeah, Taiwan has natural geographic advantages. Unlike Ukraine, Taiwan is an island. And not only is it an island, it's an island that is easy to defend because it has mountains on the east side. It has beaches on the west side that are not easy to land on. And so Xi Jinping, I think, does not want to engage in war if he's not confident that he would win that war. And I think that Taiwan, working with Japan, the United States, Australia, can demonstrate to Xi Jinping that it would be a very bad idea to wage war, or even to wage a blockade, which is an act of war, right? The United States is pretty confident that we can break a blockade, and I'm also confident that Taiwan can repel a Chinese invasion, and that the United States, as long as the United States shows up in a reasonable amount of time, that Taiwan could sustain its defense.
We often hear that the PRC can play the waiting game. So when it comes to Taiwan, hoping to wear down resistance over time. But I want to talk about what on the reverse, what can Taiwan and her partners actually exhaust the PRC instead? And what are the most effective ways to actually stretch China's military, economic, and political resources? Well,
Xi Jinping, interestingly, he has created a wartime economy already, right? If you look at what he focuses on with his economy, it is not rational from a pure economic growth perspective, right? Their economy is in recession. I don't know any serious economy that believes the Chinese economy is growing. It's probably been shrinking for the last few years, so it's smaller and smaller every year. the U.S. economy is growing every year. So China becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of American GDP. It's somewhere in the ballpark of where the Soviet Union was at the Soviet Union's peak, which was late 1970s, mid-late 1970s. Now, Xi Jinping has made his economy very inefficient. The government makes almost every decision about where investment goes. He has done severe damage to the consumer economy. Unemployment is at record highs right now. Young people, even from very good schools, have a hard time finding work, many of them. So he's also stockpiling huge amounts of resources. He's stockpiling energy, stockpiling copper and aluminum and things that would make sense in wartime, but don't really make sense during peacetime. So on the one hand, that should be a warning to us that he's very serious about his intention to try to coerce Taiwan. On the other hand, if Taiwan can maintain deterrence with the United States, it means that Xi Jinping is only doing damage to his own economy and not actually gaining the thing that he really wants to acquire, which is Taiwan, control over Taiwan itself. So we just need to be patient, but with a sense of urgency about deterrence.
Yeah. So last question I have for you is that PRC has been aggressively using lawfare, as you mentioned in the book also, on Taiwan, pushing for legal interpretations to erase Taiwan's sovereignty. So how can Taiwan actually counter the PRC legal warfare, and what role should US and her allies preventing PRC from rewriting international norms?
Yeah, well, yeah, lawfare is one of the three warfares that the People's Liberation Army writes about and is now practicing. The others are so-called 言论战, right? Public discourse war and psychological warfare, 心理战. So these three types of warfare work together. None of them work by themselves very effectively. So if you can oppose information warfare, the public discourse warfare, it makes the legal warfare less effective. Right now, I think Taiwan needs to continue paying special attention to this sort of 言论战, right? Beijing is making use of social media platforms that it controls, or at least has very significant influence over, things like Xiaohongshu or TikTok, Douyin, and people should just be aware that Beijing has all kinds of 手段 to influence narratives and to do things like promoting 所谓的以美论, right? And in the United States, they do the opposite. They promote 以台论. And so what we should really be doing is practicing 以中论 and just being aware of how many of these narratives are untruthful.
Okay. Is there any final comments you want to add?
No, I'm grateful that you made time for the interview. I hope that people take time to look at the book, 沸腾的护城河. So we'll see if it sparks more debate. I welcome criticism of the book, and I'm very glad to be here this week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for that.